The Apostle Paul writes a letter to the Hebrews, explaining to them that they are Christians and they need to follow Jesus. These were people who were formerly followers of the Hebrew tradition. They were true Jews in every sense, and they heard who Christ was and they accepted him into their hearts. The problem is, like a lot of us, we go backsliding. We go back to the old ways that we lived our lives, and these people were starting to do that. Somebody came in preaching a different message, the old message. They still had to follow all the rules and the regulations that they followed before. And Paul says, no. This is very similar to what Paul does to Peter in his early letters, of Peter trying to go back and follow the rules of eating meat. And Paul comes in and says, no, Jesus has done away with all that. You were there, you followed Jesus, you know what you're supposed to be doing, so do it. That's exactly what he's doing with these Christian Jews. He's telling them, the old ways are gone. This is the new way. In the first chapter, he breaks down very simply that Jesus is greater than the angels. He's greater than the prophets, even Elijah. In the third chapter, he breaks down, in third and fourth chapters, he breaks down that Jesus is better than Moses. Moses is the Hebrew leader, the Babe Ruth, the George Washington of the Jewish people, the founder, the perfecter, the person that they look to, their guy. In chapter 4 and 5, he breaks down that Jesus is greater than Aaron. Now, who is Aaron? Aaron is the brother of Moses, who we just learned that Jesus is greater than. In the previous 2 chapters, Jesus is greater than Moses, but he's also greater than Aaron. Now, who is Aaron again? Moses' brother, but more than that, he was the spokesperson for God, for Moses. When Moses was confronted by God on the mountain with the burning bush, he made all kinds of excuses of why he couldn't go, that he wasn't worthy, that he wouldn't be respected. And his big one was he couldn't speak well, that he had a stutter, and he couldn't do this. And God said, that's fine. Aaron will speak for you. Kind of a slap in the face of, here's your excuse. And God said, nope, Aaron's going to do it. But it was more than that. After they got down off the mountain, Moses takes the Israelites out and leads them to the promised land, just the outskirts of the promised land, because of the sin that the people had. They couldn't go in. Moses gets the rules and regulations from God. We call these the Mosaic laws or the Levitical laws. And in the book of Leviticus, in the first 3, 4, 5 chapters, we find out that Aaron and his sons have been called for another job by God. They were called to be the priests, and Aaron be the high priest. Now, what does the high priest do? There's different rules and there's different laws and regulations and different things that the priest does. He knows the scriptures, so he does decide things scripturally. He is almost a judge in this sense. He has a necklace with modern dice on it, is what we'd look at it as, and he would roll the dice on whether somebody was truthful or lying or their sin, and he would make decisions that way. But mainly, the role of the high priest was to make the sacrifice for the people on the Day of Atonement. We all have sin in our lives. Paul says that for all of sin falls short of the glory of God. We go back to the Garden of Eden and sin enters the picture, and it's always there. So what do we do with this? How do we make things right with God? If we have sin in our lives and we can't go to heaven and be with God, how do we get past that? How do we bring back the perfection? A sacrifice has to be made. So on the Day of Atonement, sacrifices would be brought to the high priest at the temple, the tabernacle. And the high priest would slaughter the sacrifices. First one for him to cover up his sins, and then one for the people to cover up their sins for the year. They'd redo the process year after year. Now I'm very simplifying this whole process here, but this is the gist of it. So he'd go into the Holy of Holies. He would cross the curtain that separated man and God. Once a year, he would go into the presence of God. First, he would splatter blood on the first sacrifice for his sins. He'd go back out. He'd get blood for the people's sins, for the town people's sins. He'd go in and splatter it, and they would be covered. Now, the tabernacle housed the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat, the presence of God, and only the high priest could enter on that day, and that day alone, and nobody else could go in. They would tie a rope around his foot when he walked into the Holy of Holies. In case he died, they could pull him out, because that's what was so special about this place. that nobody else could enter into it. So the high priest was an insanely important person. Not quite Moses, but very, very important, because that was the way that people got to the throne of God. Now, in Hebrews chapter 3 at the end, and in chapter 4 into 5, or chapter 4, and then into 5, Paul says to the Hebrews here, the Jewish people, the Jewish Christians, forget about Aaron. Forget about the high priest. Every high priest since Aaron came from Aaron's line. It was a Levitical line. It was important. It was a bloodline. But Paul says, forget about Aaron. Jesus is the high priest you need to follow. Starting in chapter 4, verse 14, it says, since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast to our confession, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. And then in chapter 5, he says, for every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifices for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, you are my son, today I have begotten you. As he says also in another place, you are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So Paul tells the people here very plainly that Jesus is our high priest. Forget the old order of things. Forget about Aaron, because Jesus is greater than Aaron. He's the greatest high priest, and he's the only high priest that we need. He breaks down how Jesus is greater in his person and his position. Chapter 4, verse 14 through 16 again, he says, since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. His person and his position. Who was Jesus? The Son of God. As it says later on, I have begotten you, the only begotten Son of God. He's not only of this earth, but he has crossed over into heaven. When the high priest entered into the Holy of Holies, the dwelling place of God, and came before that presence, the mercy seat of God, he made a sacrifice. Jesus not only crossed into the Holy of Holies, he tore the curtain down that separated in the temple, literally, the temple in Jerusalem. When Jesus cried out and died, the temple was shattered. It was wrecked. It was hit by an earthquake, if you will. And the separation, that curtain, was split in half. That there was no more separation. But not only that, Jesus crossed over into heaven, where he sits on the throne. Aaron crossed in to the throne. Jesus sits on the throne. He no longer has to go in and ask and beg. He is there. This person, this position is so much higher than what we have in Aaron. because he is God and he is sitting on that throne with God. But the ordination shows also that the ordination of Jesus to be the high priest is greater than the ordination of Aaron to be high priest. God appointed Aaron and said, "You are the high priest." Jesus was appointed as the Son of God to be our high priest in God's flesh. Chapter 5, verse 1, he says, "For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sin." And then skipping down to verse 4 through 6, he says, "And no one takes this honor for himself, but only one called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you.' As he also says in another place, 'You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek.'" Jesus was appointed by God and said, "You're no longer just a high priest in the order of Aaron. You are the high priest who makes the sacrifice from the order of Melchizedek." Now we'll get to the Melchizedek a little later. It's a very key, important part. But his ordination was set apart by God. God ordained Aaron, don't get me wrong, and don't get Paul wrong. Aaron was set apart for this role. But when God sent his son to this earth, he said, "Forget about Aaron. Forget about all the things before, because I am doing this. And this is the only high priest you need." Now, all man has sinned. And that's one of the things that makes the high priest sympathetic to the people, is he has to cover up his own sins as well. Jesus came to this earth and he suffered, he bled, and he was tempted just like each and every one of us. After he was baptized, he went out to the desert to fast and pray, and Satan came and tempted him. We don't know all the temptations that Jesus faced, but we know that anything we have faced on this earth, Jesus himself faced as well. The role that Jesus has as our high priest also gives him a superiority to Aaron in his sympathy. Chapter 5, verse 2 says this: "He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness." That's Aaron. Verse 7 and 8, "In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who were able to save from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek." Jesus, in his sympathy, offers us a sacrifice. He knew no sin. He never tasted sin. He was tempted. And that's what makes him so much superior to Aaron. The sacrifice wasn't for him, but he understood us. He dealt with us. He lived with us. He can identify with us. But he didn't fall. He didn't stumble. He didn't need to offer a sacrifice for his sins because he knew no sin. He was without sin. We go back and look at all the stories, and we talked a couple weeks ago about Jesus with a woman caught in adultery, and he bends down and he writes in the sand, and the leaders, the Jewish leaders, have to leave. They've wanted to condemn this woman. And he said, "He who is without sin cast the first stone." And when they were all gone, he said, "Woman, where are your accusers?" And she said, "They're all gone." He says, "And I don't condemn you either." Jesus was the only one that could condemn that woman. He was the only one that had the right to stone that woman. He needs no sacrifice for his sins because he knew no sin. He was perfect without blemish, which also shows us that he offered up a superior sacrifice. Aaron, or the high priest in the order of Aaron, would walk in and they would make a sacrifice, a perfect sacrifice, an animal without blemish. Jesus was that perfect sacrifice. Chapter 5, verse 3 says, because of this, he obligated to offer sacrifices for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. But in 9 and 10, we find out that the sacrifice of salvation comes through the perfect sacrifice, Jesus himself. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. The perfect sacrifice was made by our high priest, the only high priest we need. And that's why his sacrifice is more superior, because it doesn't last for a year. Every year on the Day of Atonement, the people would bring the sacrifice to Aaron, and Aaron would go make that sacrifice on their behalf. Jesus did it once and once for all. For eternity, our sins are washed away. We don't have to go every year to the temple. We don't have to go every year to the high priest, because we have a great mediator, Jesus. That's exactly what the high priest's role was a mediator between man and God. And Jesus, by offering his body on the cross for our sins and giving us the eternal salvation, is the only high priest we need, because he is it. He is the true high priest in the order of Melchizedek. Now I said earlier, not we, there's not two of us here. Well, there's two of us here. Rachel's recording this, but she's not the one writing this contrary to what many people believe. Jesus is the high priest in the order of Melchizedek. In the book of Leviticus, God calls Aaron to be the high priest. But in the book of Genesis, we find out that there is men who are called by God as high priests to offer sacrifices on behalf of people. Abraham in the book of Genesis goes to a man named Melchizedek. Melchizedek is a king and a high priest, a double honor, a king priest, if you will. Now, Melchizedek was the king of an area called Salem, which is modern-day Jerusalem. Salem is the root word in Hebrew to shalom, which means peace. The word Melchizedek means the king of righteousness. So Melchizedek is the king of righteousness and the king of peace. Think about that one for a little while. The king of righteousness, Melchizedek, is the king of peace. God says here through the Apostle Paul that Jesus doesn't come from the line of Aaron, the Levitical line of high priests. He comes from a greater line of high priests, the order of Melchizedek. Righteousness and peace. That's who our king is. That's who our high priest is. Not from an earthly line, but from a heavenly line. Only one righteous. Only one of peace. So, will you allow Jesus to be your Prince of Peace? Will you allow Jesus to be your King of Righteousness? That's who he is. That's what his role on this earth was to bring his righteousness and his peace into our lives. So, live for him. Go to him as he sits on the throne and has made that sacrifice for you. Honor him with your lives. Have a great week.